Imagine waking up one morning in the home you've worked your whole life for, only to find a notice on your door claiming you owe thousands in fines to an HOA you never even joined. At first, you think it's a mistake, a simple clerical error, but then the notices keep coming, the fines double, your mailbox disappears overnight, and suddenly neighbors who used to smile at you now turn away. Trucks stop delivering to your house. And worst of all, a black SUV with tinted windows starts showing up. Every morning, every night, watching, waiting. And just when you think it can't get worse, a single bullet casing appears on your front porch. That's when you realize this isn't about HOA fees. This is a takeover. And if you don't fight back, you'll lose everything. For 40 years, Robert and Linda Hastings worked hard, raised their children, and dreamed of one thing: retirement in a peaceful neighborhood where they could enjoy their golden years. They finally found it, a charming one-story house in a quiet cul-de-sac, nestled in a town where neighbors still waved to each other and the mailman knew your name. It was the American dream, the kind of place where they could drink coffee on the porch and watch the seasons change. And for the first few months, it was perfect. The house was well kept, the lawn was always neatly trimmed, and the community felt welcoming. Linda spent her mornings tending to her flowers, while Robert took up woodworking in his garage. They had earned this peace. But then, on a crisp Monday morning, everything changed. Robert stepped outside to grab the morning newspaper, expecting to flip through the sports section with his coffee. Instead, his eyes locked onto something else, a bright yellow notice taped to their front door. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, as if it had a mind of its own, whispering an ominous warning. He walked over, pulled it off the door, and began reading. Violation notice. It was printed in large, aggressive letters, followed by a long list of supposed infractions. The mailbox was non-compliant. The grass was overgrown. The front door was the wrong shade of beige. Robert's hands tightened around the paper. None of it made sense. Their house was pristine, meticulously maintained, even better than some of the other homes on the street. Then came the final line that made his blood run cold. Fine due, $1,750. What? For what? And who even sent this? At the bottom of the notice in small print was a name he didn't recognize: Oak Haven Homeowners Association. But here's the problem. Robert and Linda never joined an HOA. They never signed a contract, never paid a membership fee, never agreed to any of this. So why was this happening? And more importantly, who was behind it? Robert stormed inside, gripping the violation notice in one hand, reaching for his phone with the other. Linda looked up from her crossword puzzle, concerned. "What's wrong?" she asked. He handed her the paper. "Apparently, we owe nearly $2,000 to an HOA we never joined." She frowned. "But this neighborhood doesn't have an HOA. The realtor told us that before we bought the house." That was true. When they moved in, there had been no mention of HOA fees, no neighborhood meetings, nothing. And yet here they were, facing a bill for violations they never committed. Robert called their real estate agent, hoping for a quick answer. But when she picked up the phone, her response was unsettling. "That's odd," she said, her voice hesitant. "When I sold you that house, there wasn't an active HOA in place." Robert felt a chill crawl up his spine. "Wasn't active? What do you mean?" The agent hesitated before answering. "Well, there was an HOA years ago, but it dissolved. Legally, it shouldn't exist anymore." Then why was someone claiming it did? That's when Robert noticed something else. No return address on the notice. No office location. Just a phone number. He called it. After a few rings, a woman's voice answered. Sharp. Cold. Calculated. "This is Vivian Rodriguez, president of the Oak Haven Homeowners Association. How can I help you?" Robert gritted his teeth. "You can start by explaining why I just got a violation notice when I never agreed to be part of an HOA." A long silence. Then Vivian's voice returned. now dripping with artificial sweetness. "Oh, Mr. Hastings, you do live in Oak Haven, don't you?" "Yes." "Then you are part of the community, and our community has rules. We'll be expecting your payment by Friday." Click. She hung up. That night, Robert and Linda sat at their dining table, surrounded by paperwork, real estate documents, property deeds, and printouts from online forums about HOA scams. "This doesn't make sense," Linda said, rubbing her temples. "There's no legal record of this HOA." Robert exhaled sharply. Then why is she so confident? The next morning, they decided to talk to their neighbors. At first, people seemed nervous, too nervous. Some gave short answers and quickly changed the subject. Others avoided eye contact altogether. Then came Tom, the friendly old man from 3 houses down. Robert waved him over. "Tom, have you gotten these violation notices?" Tom's face paled. He glanced around, as if checking for someone watching. "I can't talk about that," he muttered. Then, in a low voice, "You should just pay it, Robert. Don't make trouble." "Why? What's going on?" Tom swallowed hard, then whispered, "They'll make your life hell." Then he hurried inside, locking his door behind him. That afternoon, Robert sat on his porch, deep in thought. The whole thing stunk of something bigger, something he couldn't yet see. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A sleek black SUV rolling slowly down the street. It wasn't a neighbor's car. He'd never seen it before. And yet it moved with purpose, crawling past his house as if inspecting every detail. Robert stood up, arms crossed, watching. The SUV didn't stop. It just kept going, disappearing around the corner. Maybe it was nothing, but then it came back. The next day, and the day after that. Always slow, always watching. A week later, another notice arrived. This time, the fine had jumped to $3,500. Now, the violations were getting absurd. Grass too green, fined $250. Mailbox not uniform, fined $500. Driveway had unauthorized cracks, fined $750. It was nonsense. A blatant shakedown. Robert took out a measuring tape and checked the mailbox height. It was identical to every other mailbox on the street. But then, as he turned to head inside, he noticed something. Linda's flower beds, normally pristine, had been trampled, crushed as if someone had walked straight through them, and spray painted on the sidewalk in front of their house in small, barely noticeable letters, with 3 words: "Pay or leave." That was the moment Robert realized. This wasn't just about money. It was about power, and he wasn't about to back down. The next morning, Robert woke up early, determined to document everything. He grabbed his phone and stepped outside to take pictures of the latest violation notice. But as he reached the curb, he stopped cold. His mailbox was gone. Not vandalized, not knocked over, completely gone. For a moment, he just stood there, stunned. He looked around, scanning the neighborhood. Every other mailbox stood exactly where it should be, except his. His heart pounded as he turned to Linda, who had followed him out. "Did you hear anything last night?" She shook her head, eyes wide. Who would steal a mailbox? Robert clenched his jaw. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was intimidation. He called the post office. After waiting on hold for nearly 20 minutes, a tired-sounding clerk finally picked up. "I need to report a missing mailbox," Robert said. The clerk sounded confused. "Sir, I don't have any reports of removal for your address." Robert gripped the phone tighter. "That's because I didn't request one. Someone took it." The clerk hesitated. Then, in a quiet voice, she said something that sent chills down Robert's spine. "You're not the first person from Oak Haven to call about a missing mailbox." Before he could ask for details, she abruptly hung up. Robert exhaled slowly. They were cutting him off. No mailbox meant no official mail, no bills, no documents, no legal notices. It was a message. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. And whoever was behind it, they were just getting started. That afternoon, Robert went into the attic looking for any old documents left by the previous homeowner. If this HOA had been pulling stunts like this before, maybe someone else had left behind a clue. As he rummaged through a dusty box marked Home Records, something caught his eye, an old envelope yellowed with age. It was tucked inside a stack of unused checks, almost as if someone had hidden it. The envelope was unsealed, and inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was shaky but clear. To whoever finds this, if you're reading this, they've probably started on you too. Don't trust the HOA. They'll try to push you out, just like they did to me. Don't let them win. Find the truth before it's too late. No name, no signature, just a final warning from someone who had lived in this very house before him. Robert's hands shook slightly as he folded the letter back into the envelope. Who had written this? And more importantly, where were they now? Fueled by anger, Robert decided it was time to fight back. He drove to the local police station, determined to report the harassment, the stolen mailbox, and the clear threats against his family. The officer at the front desk listened patiently as Robert explained everything. The fake HOA, the surveillance, the vanishing mailbox. Then, as the officer typed something into his computer, his expression suddenly changed. His eyes flicked up to Robert, wary. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "you're already on record with us." Robert frowned. "What?" The officer turned the screen toward him. "An anonymous report was filed last week. It claims you have been causing disturbances in the neighborhood, harassing HOA members, trespassing, making threats." Robert's mouth went dry. "They called in a complaint against me?" The officer nodded. "It says here that multiple residents expressed concern about your behavior." Robert's hands curled into fists. It was a setup, a preemptive strike. If he tried to report the HOA, they could point to this bogus complaint and make him look like the troublemaker. He forced himself to take a deep breath. "And you just took their word for it?" The officer hesitated. "It was an anonymous complaint. We don't act on those without further evidence." Robert stared at him. "So let me get this straight. I'm being watched, fined for ridiculous violations, and now framed as some kind of threat? And no one is doing anything." The officer sighed. "I'm sorry, sir. This sounds like a civil matter. You'll need to take it up with a lawyer." Robert pushed back from the counter, his chest tight with rage. A civil matter. Right. So that meant he was on his own. Back at home, Robert knew he had to hit them where it hurt. If the police wouldn't help, he'd dig up his own evidence. He pulled out his laptop and started researching Vivian Rodriguez, the so-called HOA president. It didn't take long for him to find her LinkedIn profile. Real estate broker, CEO of Oak Haven Property Development, LLC, former consultant for multiple neighborhood redevelopment projects. His stomach twisted. She wasn't just some neighborhood busybody. She was a developer with a history of aggressive takeovers. Robert kept digging. Public records showed that at least 5 homes in Oak Haven had been foreclosed in the last 2 years, all under mysterious circumstances. Every single one later resold to companies tied to Vivian Rodriguez. Now, it was clear. This wasn't about HOA rules. This was a real estate scam, a racket designed to force homeowners out, seize their properties, and flip them for profit. And Robert was their next target. Armed with this new information, Robert and Linda finally found a lawyer, a well-recommended local attorney named James Holloway. They met him at his office downtown, and for the first time in weeks, Robert felt a glimmer of hope. Holloway listened carefully, flipping through the documents Robert had printed. His expression darkened. "This is bad. Real bad." "So you'll take the case?" Robert asked. Holloway nodded. "Absolutely. This HOA isn't legal. We can fight this." For the first time in weeks, Robert felt relief. Until the phone rang. Holloway answered, listened, His face slowly drained of color. Then he hung up. "I'm sorry," he said, standing abruptly. "I can't take this case." Robert blinked. "What?" "But you just said—" Holloway shook his head. "Something came up. I have to go." Then he practically shoved them out of his office. As the door slammed shut behind them, Robert turned to Linda. "They got to him." Linda swallowed hard. "Now what?" Robert looked down at the files in his hands. "Now, we do this ourselves." Robert knew that if he was going to expose the HOA, he needed to do it publicly, somewhere they couldn't silence him. And he had just the place: the Oak Haven Town Hall meeting. Every month, local homeowners gathered at the community center to discuss neighborhood issues. Robert had never attended before, he never needed to. But tonight, he was coming prepared. When he and Linda arrived, the room was already full. People sat in folding chairs, murmuring to one another, while a small group of HOA board members sat at the front. At the center of them, in a crisp navy suit and pearl necklace, was Vivian Rodriguez. She didn't look at him. Not yet. An older man stepped up to the podium. "Welcome, everyone. First on the agenda." Vivian stood abruptly, cutting him off with a warm, polished smile. "Before we begin, I'd like to address an ongoing issue in our community." Robert's stomach turned. He knew what was coming. "We have a homeowner," she continued, her tone light, almost playful, "who refuses to follow our community guidelines. Despite multiple notices, he has neglected his property, harassed board members, and ignored our efforts to resolve things peacefully." She turned then, locking eyes with Robert. A murmur swept through the crowd. Robert shot up from his chair. "That's a lie, and you know it." Vivian clasped her hands. "Mr. Hastings, this is a formal meeting. If you have concerns, you'll have your chance to speak." Robert pulled out a thick folder and marched to the front. "Great, because I've got plenty to say." The room went silent as he laid out the documents. Property records proving there was no legal HOA, evidence of false citations, and public records linking Vivian to real estate scams. Murmurs turned to gasps. People leaned in, whispering. Vivian's smile faltered. But before Robert could finish, a man in the audience stood up. "I don't believe a word of this," he spat. "Vivian has done nothing but improve this neighborhood." Robert turned. It was Tom, his once friendly neighbor, but his voice wavered. His hands fidgeted. He was afraid, and Robert suddenly realized why. Tom wasn't defending Vivian because he believed her. He was doing it because he had no choice. That night, Robert and Linda sat in their dimly lit kitchen, exhausted. The town hall had been a disaster. Vivian still had the upper hand. "We need to go bigger," Linda said, stirring her tea. Robert rubbed his face. "Bigger how?" She reached for her laptop. "The media." Robert hesitated. He wasn't a social media guy. He barely used his phone for anything other than calls. But Linda wasn't talking about Facebook. She was talking about local news. They drafted a detailed email and sent it to multiple outlets. 3 responded. One reporter, Sarah Martinez, was particularly interested. The next day, she met them at their house. She listened, took notes, and examined the documents. "This is a huge story," she said, shaking her head. "If what you're saying is true, this isn't just an HOA dispute. This is fraud." Robert exhaled, relieved. But that relief didn't last, because the next morning, when they went to check Sarah's article online, it was gone, vanished, and when Robert tried to call her, straight to voicemail. Robert had suspected for weeks that the HOA was more than just a money grab. But after the article disappeared, he was sure of it. This was a takeover. He stayed up all night researching, poring over property records, financial statements, and old tax filings. By dawn, he had it. Every home foreclosed in the past 3 years had been quietly resold to companies connected to Vivian Rodriguez. That was the plan. Harass homeowners with fake violations, drain them with fines, make their lives miserable until they had no choice but to sell, then buy their homes cheap and flip them for a fortune. And Robert was next. He clenched his fists. Not if he had anything to say about it. That morning, Robert stepped outside to get some air. Then he saw it, a single bullet casing, sitting right in the center of his porch. No note, no explanation, just a silent message. Linda gasped when she saw it. Robert, what if this isn't just about money anymore? Robert picked up the casing, turning it over in his fingers. This means they're scared, he said. But deep down, for the first time, he was scared too. Robert and Linda were done playing defense. If no one else would fight back, then they'd do it themselves. But they wouldn't be alone. At the next town hall meeting, they weren't the only ones who showed up. One by one, elderly homeowners started coming forward. First, it was Mr. Jenkins, who revealed that the HOA had fined him thousands for a non-approved fence that had been there for 20 years. Then it was Mrs. Carter, whose dog was nearly taken away because the HOA claimed she had too many pets. Then it was George, a retired firefighter, who said his home insurance skyrocketed after the HOA labeled his house a hazard. For years, these people had been suffering in silence, but not anymore. They were tired of being bullied, and they were ready to fight. Vivian looked around, her once polished confidence starting to crack. For the first time, she was outnumbered, just when Robert and Linda thought they were on their own. Help arrived from an unexpected place. After the town hall meeting, an older gentleman approached them. He walked with a cane, his silver hair neatly combed back, and his sharp eyes filled with wisdom. "You're Robert Hastings?" he asked. Robert nodded. "Yeah, and you are?" The man extended his hand. "Judge Samuel Carter. Retired, and I think you might need me." Robert's heart nearly stopped. "A judge?" Samuel chuckled at their stunned faces. "Don't look so surprised. I've been watching what's happening here for a while. Vivian tried to pull the same tricks on me in my last neighborhood before I moved." Robert leaned in, and the old judge's eyes twinkled. "Let's just say she didn't win that battle." Hope surged through Robert for the first time in weeks. "Can you help us?" Judge Carter smirked. "Son, I didn't come all the way down here just to shake your hand." That evening, Robert, Linda, and a few of their most trusted neighbors met at Judge Carter's house. The air was thick with tension and anticipation. Carter spread out a stack of legal documents across his coffee table. "This," he said, pointing, "is how we take her down." He explained that Vivian's so-called HOA had no legal foundation. Not only was it unregistered, but every fine she issued was technically fraud. Then came the bombshell. "I reached out to an old colleague at the State Attorney General's office," Carter said. "They're very interested in this case." Linda gasped. "You mean?" Judge Carter nodded. "If we get the right evidence, Vivian isn't just losing her fake HOA. She could be looking at criminal charges." Robert felt a surge of adrenaline. For the first time, Vivian wasn't just a looming threat. She was vulnerable. The legal battle came fast and furious. Judge Carter helped Robert and the other homeowners file a lawsuit against the HOA. The case caught the attention of local media, and suddenly Vivian was on the defensive. The final hearing was packed. Vivian walked in with her usual confidence, flanked by her lawyers. But the moment Robert's legal team began presenting evidence, her composure started to crack. They laid it all out. Property records proving the HOA was never legally reactivated. Fake citations and fraudulent fines. Ties between Vivian and real estate companies that had bought foreclosed homes. Testimonies from elderly homeowners who had been forced out. Then came the final nail in the coffin. "Miss Rodriguez," the attorney said, holding up a document, "can you explain why your name appears on an internal memo from Oak Haven Property Development discussing forced acquisitions of multiple homes in this neighborhood?" Vivian's face turned pale. The memo detailed plans to pressure homeowners into selling, listing Robert's house as the next target. Gasps filled the courtroom. Vivian's lawyer whispered something in her ear. Her lips tightened, and then she stood up and walked out. She knew. She had lost. Vivian's resignation didn't just end the fake HOA. It triggered a chain reaction. The lawsuit gained national attention, with other homeowners across the country sharing their own horror stories about HOAs gone rogue. State lawmakers introduced new bills aimed at preventing HOA abuse, strengthening homeowner rights, and making sure no one else suffered the way Robert and his neighbors had. And then the final blow came. Vivian Rodriguez was officially indicted on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and elder exploitation. It wasn't just a victory. It was justice. A few months later, Robert sat on his porch, sipping his coffee, the same spot where months ago he first saw that yellow violation notice. Only now there were no more notices, no threats, no HOA spies, just peace. Linda sat beside him, smiling as the sun warmed her face. "You know," she said, "I almost gave up. I thought about selling, just to get away from it all." Robert exhaled. "Me too." She squeezed his hand, but we didn't. Robert looked around at their neighborhood, the same one Vivian had tried to take from them. Now it was theirs again. A few doors down, Judge Carter was mowing his lawn. Tom, their once nervous neighbor, waved as he walked his dog. The community wasn't just surviving. It was thriving. Robert leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. They had stood up to the bullies. They had fought back. And in the end, they had won.